Hello, welcome to Prairie Conservation Action Plan's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Morose, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Every month, PCAP asks someone to present either in the form of a webinar or an in-person talk in a Saskatchewan community on anything to do with native prairie conservation or species at risk. Stay tuned for our upcoming Native Prairie Speaker Series. On May 3rd, Chet Neufeld with the Native Plant Society of Saskatchewan will be doing a webinar about the Master Naturalist Program. If you are in the Saskatoon area on May 23rd, swing by Winston's Pub for our speaker series. Carrie Hecker from Environment Canada will be doing a presentation about Last Mountain Lake and piping plovers. This is part of the Saskatoon Nature City Festival. I would like to take a moment to note that in-kind support for today's webinar has been given by Brenda Dale. This project was undertaken with the financial support of the Government of Canada and the Federal Department of Environment and Climate Change Canada. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard, and they will be answered at the end. Brenda Dale was born and raised in Regina. Her family owned a farm near Last Mountain Lake, so she was lucky enough to split her time between the city and the farm and the lake. She did her graduate research on grassland birds at the Last Mountain Lake National Wildlife Area. After a decade of contracting work related mainly to grassland birds, she joined the Canadian Wildlife Service, where she continued to study grassland birds and their responses to agricultural, industrial, and conservation practices. Another part of her job was the promotion of volunteer monitoring, and the talk she will give is an updated version of talks she has given throughout Western Canada up to her retirement in fall 2015. She has and still does participate in volunteer monitoring herself, nest record schemes, banding, breeding bird survey, breeding bird atlas, and eBird. And now I will turn it over to Brenda. Brenda, can you hear us okay?
Yes.
You're welcome to go ahead whenever you're ready. We can see your screen here.
I just have to remember the correct button to push. I think that's it.
Perfect.
So, hello everyone. I don't know, that is not what I wanted to show. I apologize. You'd think I hadn't done this before, but I have. There we go. We'll try it again. There we go. So this title refers to the fact that people who are already observing and counting birds on their own can take the step of becoming involved in citizen science. And by participating in citizen science, you can help to conserve the birds that you are enjoying watching. So what is citizen science? Just to make sure that everybody knows. It is a partnership between volunteers and professional scientists. In theory, the scientists collect the citizen scientists collect the scientific data, and then the scientists analyze the data and examine the results. And this certainly does lead to more efficient and effective conservation. But in practice, actually, the citizens are also sometimes involved in the analysis, and the scientists often participate in collecting the data as well. So my talk today, I'm just going to give you a brief outline. And my purpose is to recognize the importance of citizen scientists. I want anybody who's already participating to understand the full value of what they're doing. And I hope that others who may already be bird watching but aren't participating in citizen science will want to start to participate and to contribute to the conservation of birds. So I guess the obvious question is, why would you want to participate? Why would you want to get up at 3 a.m. and go out in mosquito season? And it's a simple answer, usually because we love birds, and I hope because we want to help them. So to continue, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about some citizen science surveys And there are literally hundreds of different kinds of citizen science projects out there. But what I'm going to concentrate on is those that are at a national or international level that have a very good probability of being able to collect enough data to actually contribute to conservation. So for each of these surveys that I'm going to talk about, where it applies, I'll provide a little history on the survey. I won't in all cases. I'll talk about what kind of data is collected and how it's collected, which will give you an idea of the skill level and the time commitment involved in participating. And then I'll give examples of how the data is used for conservation. And in a few cases, I'll talk a bit about current participation. And last, there'll just be a few words about training and support that's available. So the programs I'm going to talk about are collect three different kinds of data. They collect data on distribution and changes in distribution, and then on productivity and survival, and on trends. And these are the three kinds of information we need in combination for any species to try and do effective conservation. And better yet, if this data can be linked to habitat by the survey, then that makes it even more effective for conservation. So I'm going to talk about some surveys of each of these types, and you'll also see some surveys that are shown in a more muted font, and those are ones I won't actually be talking about, but they contribute to these kinds of data. You'll also notice there's a lot of word marks for various organizations off to the side, and that's because there are many different organizations involved in these citizen science projects. And although I worked for Canadian Wildlife Service and part of Environment and Climate Change Canada, there are many different organizations that organize very valuable surveys. So only some of them will be from the organization I used to work for. So the first one I'm going to talk about is breeding bird atlases. So at the top you see a list of some that are been completed, many of them quite recently, and maybe some that are just about to start, like Ontario. And I would encourage you to go on any of their websites and you will see how interesting the data is that they collect. Just simply, you know, type in the province name and breeding bird atlas and you would probably find their website. But Saskatchewan is this year starting their own breeding bird atlas, and there's quite a few people involved, as you can see from the logos at the bottom of the screen. And I've included a link here. Now, a word about the links. I'm going to give a link for every survey that I talk about, and sometimes more than one. Don't worry about that. Caitlin will be circulating a document that I've prepared that will summarize for each survey the effort, the skill level, and some of these links, so that if there's something that interests you, you'll be able to find it in the document that Caitlin will circulate after the talk. So for a breeding bird atlas, the atlas itself takes 5 years of field work, but that doesn't mean you have to do that much work. Your effort can be from a few hours, if you shared a square, to as much as you want. All skill levels can help, and citizen scientists or one person or a group of people can adopt one or several of these blocks. And an atlas, once completed, is repeated every 20 years and provides information on relative abundance, distribution, and distribution changes. So atlases in action. On the right-hand side here, I've just shown you a map from the recently completed Manitoba breeding bird atlas. This one is for American avocet. And so you can see the kind of information it provides. If you look, the gray squares are squares that have been atlased, but they didn't have this species. So you can see that the area that was surveyed far exceeds the distribution of this particular species. And there's different levels of breeding evidence. So these yellow squares indicate possible and the slightly darker squares are probable, and the dark squares are confirmed breeding. So this is the kind of evidence it ends up producing, and this data can be used by, has been used and is used by Environment Canada and also by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada to assess status for species. And this information is also starting to be standardly included in Birds of North America accounts. The next one I want to talk about is the Christmas bird count. It began in 1900. So the old tradition was that there was a side hunt on Christmas Day, and whoever shot the most species got the honors for the day. And in 1900, Frank Chapman proposed counting the birds rather than killing them. And on that first Christmas bird count, 27 participants at 25 locations counted a little over 18,000 birds of 89 species, and that was the first Christmas bird count. 2 of those 25 counts were in Canada, one in New Brunswick and one in Ontario. So the National Audubon coordinates the Christmas bird count, and the Canadian partner is Bird Studies Canada. The day of the count is chosen for logistical reasons, and so the weather can vary a lot from year to year, which influences the bird occurrence, their observability, and also the number of observers, because if the weather's really terrible, sometimes not too many observers show up. The data has always been published. Originally it was published in American Birds, but from the 98th count on, the results are online. There's certainly a variability in the effort and skill level that can be included in this survey. So you can do it for just a short time, or you can you can participate. It takes 1 day a year to participate, but you may choose to participate in multiple counts because they're not all on Boxing Day. And you can be anywhere from a beginner to very experienced. It's a great way to start learning more because you may be paired with people that are more experienced and can learn from them. And the survey provides information on winter distribution and changes in winter distribution. And you'll notice that I've got that population, abundance, and trends. I've got it a bit smudged because there are limitations to how much we can determine about abundance and trend, because there is variability in the effort that is expended, and it's hard to account for that. And it does do a great job of tracking changes in distribution, but not necessarily the best for trends for abundance. But it is extremely effective at tracking changes in distribution. And here's an example. The Eurasian collared dove was found on 11 Christmas bird counts in 2006, and by 2012 it was on 91. House finches were on only 2 Christmas bird counts in 1958, but up to 209 Christmas bird counts in 2012. And Audubon used the information from Christmas bird count to create a climate change report. So of the over 300 observed species, they found that 177 of those species had moved north or had moved inland during the course of over the course of the Christmas bird count's history. And 60 of those species had moved or expanded their range in excess of 100 miles. So this data is very effective at showing changes in distribution and in possibly relating it to factors such as climate change. As I mentioned, there are issues with it for trends, but it is the best data or good corroborating data for species that happen to breed in undeveloped areas such as the north, but winter in areas with counts. So an example of that would be it's the best data we have for species like Smith's longspur. So next I want to talk about checklists. So checklist is a general term for this kind of a survey, and eBird is the particular survey that I would be encouraging people to participate in. It's extremely compatible with birding because you really don't have to change anything about what you're already doing. You just have to record what you're seeing and hearing, and provide information on where you were and when you were there. So the time commitment is completely variable from participating once for a single rare bird you saw to daily. And the data can be submitted by all skill levels. So going through a little history here, this survey, the checklist idea, was started in Quebec in 1950, and people submitted their lists, and I would say actually these numbers are now probably quite a bit exceeded, but hundreds of thousands of checklists have been submitted for thousands of sites, many millions of observations. Their website is available. I've given the link there if you want to explore more of what they've done. And they've actually calculated trends, and they have done a complete atlas just simply based on their checklists in Quebec. Environment Canada, Canadian Wildlife Service started a checklist in the Northwest Territories because they thought it was a good idea. And then Cornell launched the eBird program in 2002. And in Canada, eBird is managed by Bird Studies Canada, and you can submit your observations and examine your data online, and you can examine the data of others. So many people think it's just a checklist is just a list of the species seen in the area, but it can be much more. It's informal, but in many ways standardized, and it allows us to answer conservation questions like where does a species occur, how many are there, and is it changing? Even though on their own they're just a few observations, each checklist contributes answers to these kind of questions. And so we can get information on the presence and absence of rare species. It's particularly great for rare species. Changes in distribution and timing of arrival or migration. Detections, it can detect population trends. A colleague of mine compared the trends from the Quebec checklist to the breeding bird survey and found that they were very comparable. It can identify diverse or unique habitats because they can find that particular areas, if you look at all the checklists, have far more species than other areas, or have unique species, or have a lot of species at risk. It can evaluate the importance of migratory stopover sites. And importantly for you as a participant, it provides experience, and you can learn from others. Again, by going out birding with other people, you can learn more and expand your knowledge base. And it's also great training for other surveys as well. So now I want to talk a little bit more. I want to give a more specific example of checklist surveys in action. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to look at this map and think about what species it might be for. So you can see that the darker the color, the higher the probability. So 40 to 100% is this very dark purple. And then you can also see that gray squares are squares that where they've received lists, but the bird wasn't observed. So you can be fairly certain that this is the distribution of this species. And it's most abundant in the prairies, but it does occur less so in other areas that have open areas but aren't necessarily pure prairie. So it's not going to be an absolute prairie specialist, but it's going to be a prairie bird. So hopefully you all have a guess in mind. And it was the western meadowlark. So now what I want to do is compare that eBird map on the right with the map from the breeding bird survey. So I'll be talking about the breeding bird survey later, but the point here is that the breeding bird survey is the most rigorous survey we have. It's highly standardized, and yet the day-to-day observations of many birders, when used cumulatively, have given us virtually the same information on both distribution and relative abundance. So it can be extremely powerful, even though we're each only contributing a little bit from our day-to-day birding. And a second example I want to give you is from a recent paper, came out in 2015, from some researchers in Florida. They took the standard bird surveys that they had been doing with trained observers where they took into account the time of day, the tides, all kinds of factors that could affect the number of birds, and they compared it to eBird observations from the same site. And they found that both the quantity and the quality of data was similar, and the conclusions on the species present and the temporal trends in their presence was very similar. But eBird actually picked up some rare species that the formal surveys missed, even though they involved hundreds and hundreds of hours by professional biologists. So this is another example to show you that many observations, when brought together, even though they're not done in the strictest way, can be very powerful and helpful. So the next thing I want to talk about is nest records. They began as cards in the 1950s, and there was a scheme in each region of Canada, and the Prairies had about 70,000 cards, which were kept at the Manitoba Museum of Man and Nature. Then in the early 2000s, I guess it was, the Wildlife Service in the Prairies and the Ontario Nest Record Scheme were leaders in trying to shift the cards to an electronic format. And we've taken many of the old cards and translated them into the new coding scheme so that we can make use of the data that was already there, but it also now exists as an online scheme. So you basically fill out one card. Well, in this case, it would be filling out a record online. And you have to have data such as the species, the location, the number of eggs and nestlings, any behavior that was observed, and there's all kinds of little bubbles for habitat that can be filled out. And if you have only one visit to a nest, it does give information about distribution and timing. And if you have several visits to the same nest, it provides information on productivity. So this project is now coordinated in Canada by Bird Studies Canada, and I've got a website there for you. There's currently relatively little participation in the online scheme. So there's, in the basis of maybe 100 records for Saskatchewan, a little under 1,000 for Alberta, and under 1,000 for Manitoba. So it's underutilized at this time compared to the old paper cards, but it is something people can participate in anytime they find a nest. You don't need to have the card with you, but you do need to be familiar with the kind of data that you're going to need to enter so that when you're in the field and you come across a nest, you can collect the right information. And you can download a field sheet from this website. So of those many cards across the country, Environment Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada used about 35,000 cards to calculate nest calendars, which have been put on their website. They're specific to the region and to the habitat and to the ecozone. And they give a visual presentation of the chance of destroying a nest. And these are put there as a guide to industry and agriculture and so on, so that they know what the probability is if they proceed with their development or their activities, whether they may destroy a nest. And in the future, this same data will be examined for changes in timing, and changes in timing of nesting, changes in clutch size, looking at patterns in predation, and trying to relate them to habitat management or climate. So it's already being quite valuable to industry in guiding prevention of incidental take, but it has many more uses that can be made of it. So I want to talk a little bit about bird banding in general. It is an important scientific tool, provides a lot of very important information, and contributes to our basic scientific knowledge about birds and the places where they live. Banding does require a high skill level, but non-banders can assist through reporting bands and markers. So in North America, since 1908, we've banded about 70 million birds. And there have been about 4 million encounters. So an encounter is either where you say the bird is dead and you get the band, or there can also be encounters where the bird is recaptured and released, but you've recorded the band, or there are such things as flags on legs and neck collars, nasal tags, and so on, that the information can be recorded without even recapturing the bird. So each year there's about 300,000 birds banded in Canada, and there's about 30,000 encounters, and most of those are from returned bands from waterfowl that have been shot. So of those encounters of birds that were banded in Canada, the majority of them are actually encountered in the United States, with Canada being next. And as you go down the left side of this slide, the countries are in decreasing order of how likely they are to have had some returns. And there are very occasional encounters from Europe, Africa, South Pacific, and Asia. But only 0.5% are encountered internationally outside of the US or Canada. So how do those banding returns, what kind of action can they generate? So this is one example. This is the Ferruginous hawk from the Canadian Banding Atlas. And the banding atlases I've got on the left side, there are 4 of them. They're all online, and they were done at various times, but they all refer to data that ends as of 1995. And I will say that the Smithsonian Institute is planning a North American-wide bird atlas that will be coming soon. So anyway, basically from this you can see that many of the birds banded in the prairies, it gives you information on where they winter and the areas that they travel through on the way. So that is valuable information for conservation. Another thing that can come out of it is longevity information. So these are, I'm going to just show you some examples from the Bird Banding Lab website on longevity. And I've used, these aren't necessarily the oldest birds on record, but I've used an example where the bird was either banded or recovered in Canada. So this is a bald eagle, and the recovery was at a minimum of 32 years and 10 months. And it was recovered in New Brunswick, where it was struck on a highway. And this is an American avocet. Now, I have to say I wasn't terribly shocked to think that an eagle could live to be over 30 years old, but I was a bit surprised to think that a shorebird, which has a fairly long and arduous migration, could live to be 15 years and 1 month. This gull was actually a minimum of 25 years and 4 months. It was banded in Canada, but now, sorry, I shouldn't say this gull because these are just pictures of the species in question. It's not the actual bird that was 25 years and 4 months, but a ring-billed gull of a minimum of 25 years and 4 months. The band was read at a dump in New York, and that's how they know this bird reached at least that age. Ruby-throated hummingbird, 9 years. And again, I find this one quite amazing because you think of how tiny they are, how incredibly fast their metabolism works, and how arduous migration must be. And it's just amazing to think one could potentially live that long. Now this American redstart, this is again a very minimum age for this particular individual that was recaptured at 10 years and 1 month because it was captured in a net, the band recorded, and the bird released. So it lived longer than that, 10 years and 1 month. That's just a minimum age. And the same thing for this white-throated sparrow that was caught at 14 years and 11 months, the band read, and the bird released. So the message from all that is to report all bird bands and markers. You can report them online through the Bandit program if you're a bander. You can call a toll-free number, or you can email. And this would include markers, include things like colored leg bands, flags, neck collars on geese, nasal saddles on waterfowl, etc. So migration monitoring is a specific banding program, and it counts birds as they pass through the site. Now maybe this wasn't the best example for me to use for prairie speakers, in that this program is aimed at trying to get information about species that breed in the north where we can't really monitor them directly while they're breeding, but capturing them as they come through during migration. So the prairies is actually quite great for that, but the birds are not actually breeding in the prairies. So it counts birds as they pass through the site, and it involves daily collection. During migration, you capture birds and band them. There's also a semi-standard count that's done each day. Observations on birds that are observed while you're, say, visiting the nets or even just having your coffee break. And then the data is corrected for the weather conditions, and there's a yearly total used as an index of abundance. So it's a huge amount of data, a huge amount of work that is condensed down to one data point. So it's a very effort-intense method. But it is done in a relatively standardized way based on international standards. We do have 6 stations in the prairies, and they are all part of the Canadian Migration Monitoring Network. And in addition to the trend data that can come from this, there's also research. And actually, I think this is some of the most important conservation information that we get from migration monitoring. So stable isotopes are now helping us determine the source location of birds that are captured in the prairies. Fat accumulation gives us a clue to habitat value. So if you have birds that are at your site that are always having fairly high fat accumulation, that shows that the kind of habitat where your location is extremely valuable during migration. And that it has conservation value to have that kind of knowledge about what habitats are most useful to these migrants. A lot has been learned about migration strategies and molt strategies through the research at these stations, and also about site fidelity. I remember being at Long Point when they captured a yellow warbler that it was his 9th year in a row he'd been captured at their site. So they knew that he didn't actually breed on their site, but he bred somewhere very near. And so some of it can be extremely interesting. And there's also been work, again, with yellow warblers about improved identification, where they've actually been able to refine the way that they can differentiate between young male and female yellow warblers. So there's many, many pieces of information that have been collected. And of course, it's very exciting to have these birds in your hand. So I want to talk about the breeding bird survey, the BBS as it's referred to. So it was created in 1966 by Chandler Robbins, and he just died recently. I believe he was 93, and I have met the man, and he was probably in the office up to a few weeks before he died. He didn't stop working when he retired at all. So he developed this survey, and there are about 4,100 routes in total in North America. So in Canada, we have just around 1,000 routes in Canada, and about 450 to 500 of them are run each year. So it's an international road-based monitoring program of breeding birds. And in Canada, sorry about that, I should have done that. Talked about that there. In Canada, we have trouble finding safe permanent routes in the north, as well as people who could run them. So most of our routes are concentrated in the southern part of Canada. So the method, it's done on a road. Doesn't have to be a great road necessarily, but it's on a road. It's 40 kilometers long. You stop 50 times every half mile or 800 meters. and you look and listen for birds for 3 minutes. The placement is based on degree blocks, so 1 degree of latitude and longitude, and then within that degree block, the start point and the direction when they were establishing the route was random. And then after that, once the route has been established, then you try and do it once a year during the height of the breeding season. You have to start very early, half an hour before sunrise, and there have to be favorable weather conditions. So there's a lot of standardization to how the survey is done. And it takes about 2 days per route. And the reason I say that is because although it's 1 day to do the survey, you have to travel usually to where the route is. You preview it. You do the route. You have to get home, enter the data, check the data. So it's probably about a 2-day commitment for each route that you take on. And it does need to be you do have to have a high skill level, because you have to be able to identify all the birds in the area of your route from either sight or song. And just a word about observers. So there was a survey done in 2006, and they talked to various observers, and the reasons for running a breeding bird survey route were that about 80% said it was for their pleasure, and about 70% said they did it because they wanted to contribute to conservation. There's about 2,000 active observers and 1,000 assistants. Most are volunteers, and 98% have been birding for 6 to 10 years. And that's not surprising, because you do have to have such a good level of knowledge about the birds before you're able to do it. And I've got actually 2 examples here. They're both from Alberta, but the people on the bottom, they were celebrating their 40th time they'd done their route. They took this picture by the side of the road after they finished. And then the gentleman on the right-hand side is the coordinator for Alberta, and he will be doing, both these gentlemen actually, this gentleman here and Jack, will be doing their route for the 50th time this year, which is just mind-boggling. So the breeding bird survey results. So there's online, you can look at the data both on the US site and on the Canadian site. I've put the links at the bottom of the page here. And they both have things like both tables and graphs of the trend data. And they also have maps. So in the case of the US site, it would give you the red areas are areas where the trend is negative, blue areas, I believe it's sort of neutral, and then green it's positive. So there's many bits of information that come from the massive amount of data that's been collected. So there's 50 years of population data, which gives us both trends and relative abundance. There's about, well, probably far more than 5 million observations now, with about 200,000 added each year. Of these records, about 20% are from Canada, and this vast amount of data is very heavily used. So who uses the breeding bird survey data? It's probably easier to say who doesn't use it, but it's used by a wide variety of government and non-government agencies, and it's the best and most widely recognized source of long-term continental data on land birds in particular available. So there's a little over 250 species where they have enough data to provide trend data. And I'm just going to give a specific example out of all these things. As I say, there's a lot of use, but just to give one specific example, for species assessments, 19 of the 79 endangered, threatened species are special concern species are there specifically because of the breeding bird survey trends. And although that's not the majority, early screening for candidate species to be examined by COSEWIC is based on the breeding bird survey. So that's one very specific way that the data is used for conservation. Without long-term trend data at the continental scale, we would have had a difficult time convincing anyone about the declines in grassland birds or neotropical migrants, and that they merited further research and management. Most recently, there's been alarms over the declines in aerial insectivores, and this has spurred working groups and research. The research and conservation action that the BBS has stimulated is in large part because there is good monitoring data to call our attention to these species. So if a species can't be monitored, then it's not likely to get any attention. There have been many hundreds of published papers based on the breeding bird survey. So this is just another example. The state of Canada's birds was based entirely on the breeding bird survey, and this again, highlights some of the groups that are in big trouble and lets us concentrate our conservation dollars on these species. So in summary, if you want to contribute to citizen science, it's more like, when do you have the time? If you want to participate in eBird, you can do it year-round. If you want to look at a breeding bird atlas, it's obviously March to maybe about August. Migration monitoring is done in the spring and in the late summer, fall. Nest cards are done during breeding season, as is the breeding bird survey. And the Christmas bird count is done in December and January. So there's some citizen science project you could be participating in pretty well any time of the year. But if you're feeling a little rusty about whether or not you're ready to do some of these things, I just want to talk a little bit about a training tool that's available. There are, of course, many things. There's apps, there's many things online. This is one I particularly know about. It's Nature Instruct, which is done by Environment and Climate Change Canada, the US GS, and also by a conservation organization from Mexico. But having said that, actually Canada did the bulk of work to create this site. It has two different modules within it. One is Dendroica, which is for birders to improve their identification skills, and Paranga, which helps to improve avian aging and sexing skills. So if you're a bander, you'd use the one on the right, and if you just want to improve your birding skills, you'd use the one on the left. So you go on this site and you can choose whether you, Canada, and then you can choose whether you want to register. And really the only thing that helps about registering is that you can then create custom lists so that you don't have to scroll through all the species in Canada. You can create custom lists for yourself when you're practicing and quizzing yourself. And it does have a quiz mode. So when you have the quiz mode, they don't show you the bird to begin with, but they show it to you once you get it correct. When you're looking at an individual species, going back here, when you're looking at an individual species, it will have anywhere from a few to maybe 20 different images for that species, and it will have a number of audio clips. So you can get quite a bit of practice in what the bird will look like and sound like at various, it's got it in various plumages, and of course it's got calls as well as songs. So it's a really great way to learn and then to quiz yourself to see how ready you might be to actually identify that species in the field. So I think that that is all I have to say about this. I thank you for attending today, and I hope that some of you may want to begin to participate in citizen science. And for those of you who already are, if you didn't already know, I hope you feel really proud. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brenda. That was amazing. I know I learned a lot, and I'm definitely motivated for the Bird Atlas coming up. I would just like to remind all of our listeners today that if you have any questions, just type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard. And Brenda, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what initially interested you in birds.
Well, when I was young, and I had, as I said in my introduction, I was fortunate enough to have time on our farm and on the at the lake, and I used to spend all my time really watching mammals. And I knew there were things like robins and gulls and hawks and whatever. I didn't really notice birds that much. And my very last semester of university, I took an ornithology class, and we were going through all these various birds that were, around. And I remember in particular, we were shown an American avocet, and I thought, pictures of this, and I thought, there's no way there's anything like that around here. I would have noticed that. And that Friday when we were driving to the farm, here was this American avocet by the side of the road, and I thought, oh my God, I've been blind my whole life. And I just got turned on to birds, and that was that. I suddenly realized how much was around me that I'd been missing, and I just found them totally fascinating.
Wow. Well, thank you very much for sharing that story. If any listeners out there have any questions, please feel free to type it in. I would just like to remind everyone to check out the upcoming events that PCAP has going on, and you can go to our website, pcap-sk.org, click on Communications and Native Prairie Speaker Series, or you can click on upcoming events. And for all of our listeners there, when you end this webinar, you will have a quick survey that will pop up. If you don't mind answering the 3 or 4 questions that are there, it'll take about a minute or so. We'll really appreciate that. And just a reminder too that this webinar has been recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube this afternoon, and you're welcome to pass on the link to anyone who was not able to make it today. So it doesn't look like we have any more questions coming in. So with that, I would just like to thank you, Brenda, for the very interesting presentation, very informative. And I would like to thank all of our listeners for attending. So with that, thank you everyone, and have a great day. Oh, sorry, Brenda, if you're still there, it looks like there's one question or comment. Sorry, it says, thanks, Brenda, great presentation from a listener named Catherine.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for sharing, Catherine. Okay, have a great day, everyone.